Hey, welcome back to another Roundup session with Holly McKay. So it's the month of September 2024, and we're going to round up three articles today, and that Holly's written in the past 30 days. And so sit back and get ready to enjoy a little bit more color. So what's going on? How are you doing today, Holly?
I'm hanging in there, Dennis. Thank you for asking.
Very good. Okay, so very good. Yeah, and so let's just get right into it. First article we really want to cover is you wrote something that went over basically a synopsis of what's happened in the 3 years since the fall of Afghanistan. And there was a lot of stuff in it that I think it well deserved covering. So like, why don't you start off with that and just kind of like give a recap of, what's really happening in that country and to the former players that were part of that country and where they are now. Because that's a fascinating story, I think.
Yeah. Well, it was just over a little over 3 years ago now that the US left Afghanistan. And of course, at the time, there was a lot of reports about a lot of these officials, including the president at the time, President Ghani, taking copious amounts of money sort of with them as they fled and really leaving behind this country in disarray. And it was really indicative to me that 3 years on that we really never got to the root of what was taken, which was effectively in large amounts US taxpayer dollars. Who took what? Corruption was really the root of all the problems in Afghanistan, including how and why the Taliban was able to come back. And this was just a very blatant theft, if you will. I mean, in any other country, if you or I stole millions of government dollars, we would certainly be in jail for a very long time. But the fact that we were never really able to get answers, and although John Sofkop Etsagar has done just brilliant work over the decades in Afghanistan, I think a lot of his work has sort of been sort of pushed aside. It's been very challenging for him to get cooperation, and as we saw in the cigar report, sort of surrounding um, the corruption toward the end, there really wasn't any definitive answers. And I think it was important to remember that a lot of these leaders are leading very lavish lives, predominantly in Dubai and other countries, all while Afghan people suffer, while women's voices quite literally have been silenced. And there was never any reckoning, there was never any answers. And I think that that is a real insult to the American people, to the people that supported the mission in Afghanistan. And the fact that these leaders who were US backed were able to get away with this is really quite shocking. So in the piece, I sort of really go into a lot of detail about the leadership and where they are now and the lives that they're living now and what was taken and why we don't have any answers.
Yeah. Well, so I think you pointed out quite well. Most of these people are living quite opulent lives on their what you would and I would probably call ill-gotten gains. Um, at the same time, I think when you asked me about this one and I gave you, my interpretation of it, the degree of duplicity of the United States in enabling that degree of corruption is yet another thing that hasn't been reckoned with. So
Mm.
while you got these people have gotten away with it, uh, it's not like we don't have the ability to look into it. There's my little friend right there.
Oh,
The
we've had a rough day. Mum's been on a lot of calls today, and Raven needs some mum time.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, well, I like having her around. So uh yeah, so like um it's really a reckoning of two pieces when at least the way I've always interpreted it, and no prospect for reconciliation on either front.
I mean, not in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is under Taliban rule for goodness knows how long now. Um, Again, a lot of steps along the way that could have stopped what's happened, um, and they weren't taken. And I think that there are many individuals that were part of this systematic corruption, and again, they got away with it, and that is just to me, it's very insulting.
Are they going to be able to get away with it some more, do you think? Because, there are reports that these people are trying to reorganize themselves to make themselves relevant to the future of Afghanistan, yet again, with threatening to restart the wars if they're not listened to. Should
Who's
should the
going to
world pay
support
them
that?
any mind?
Who's going to support that? I mean, I think the US has paid enough in blood and treasure. I feel for the Afghan people. I feel particularly for the Afghan women. Um, and I just, I don't think that's the answer. I don't think war right now is the answer to Afghanistan's problems, especially with corruption as it is. I think the moment there's any sort of money exchanging hands, it's not going to go into the right hands, and we need to learn from history.
There you go. All right. Well, um, yeah, I kind of agree with you on that one. So let's don't know exactly how that'll turn out, but clearly greed continues and resolution of that is a long way from being here. Let's turn a little bit to you wrote this other article that was really, I mean, it had a whole bunch of stuff in there about cultural practices that are just plain wrong. And even and there's and what you wrote was there comes a point where
Sorry,
you can't,
monkeys.
yeah, no, that's fine. Where you cannot really just sit by and let culture allow things that are egregiously wrong to continue. So,
Mm.
and you spent quite a bit of time on that article because it covered a lot of ground. So talk about that a little bit more and, like where that is, what motivates you and why are you tracking these issues?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot. So I sort of wanted to sit down and put a little bit into words. I think obviously when we travel, learning about different cultures, learning about the way that people live their lives that can be very different to ours is really a beautiful thing. And that's what interests me most about the work I do. More than war is just different cultures, and I love that. You can never stop learning. But I think at the same time, there is a lot of attention paid to cultural sensitivity. And of course that is extremely important, but we also have to recognize this, and it can be a very delicate balance, um, of cultural sensitivity, yes, but also recognizing when there's a right and there's a wrong, and when people are being hurt, um, for whatever cultural reasons. I think that's when we have a moral responsibility, and often that can be misconstrued as some sort of you know bigger power sort of trying to come in and tell another country or culture what to do. And I think that that's sort of a lame excuse. What we have to recognize again is right and wrong, when we need to stand up and take a stand for that. And I sort of outline a couple of examples. FGM, being a big one, female genital mutilation, which is a very widely spread cultural practice with really horrific ramifications for girls and women. And that needs to be spoken against. I talk about how there were a lot of cultural practices in history that no longer exist because outsiders were had the strength to stand up. And I use the example of sati in the Hindu religion, where when husbands died, women were essentially burned on their grave. Their wives were burned on their grave. And it was sort of portrayed as being something that the women wanted to join their partners in the sort of eternal life. But that's really I mean, it's abhorrent when you think about it. And at the time, there were some British commanders that could have came in and said, we're going to put a stop to this. And if you do this one more time, basically, we're going to burn you. And it took that kind of very vocal retaliation to eventually stop the practice. And of course, it doesn't exist today. And had maybe an outside voice not come in to put their foot down on that, who knows, if it would continue today. So I do think sometimes in our quest to be culturally sensitive, we can overlook what is really essentially human rights abuses.
Yeah. Well, when I read that article, I asked myself, um, how much power does the world really have to influence those things at this point? Um, because one, the culture is spread now throughout the world, and two, in cases where practices like that were stopped during the colonial era, you had a colonial power that had the power to do things like that. It's much more difficult now, and so it's really moral high ground that is required on a global scale.
Mm. It is a moral high ground. And I think in any of these situations, as in the case of Sati, it's working with locals too. And there were certainly, many powerful voices within Hindu communities that were also against this. So I think, yeah, it's also, it is where possible, it is working with locals who also want to take a stand and maybe need that extra support or that extra megaphone, if you will. And I think that is the key to making lasting change. It can be really difficult to change a lot of these practices, particularly if they've been ingrained in cultures for a really long time, if you are just a sole outside voice. So I think there is collaboration, just as there is with things like stoning or FGM, where there are certainly local activists and people that are very much against that and willing to take a stand against it. But um, having that support, I think, is what drives change forward.
Okay. Well, God, like my mind is racing with the number of issues in the world, and 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 in particular how diasporas, the people living in other countries carrying on with those practices that even in countries where those practices are, you know, illegal,
Mm.
but it still happens. It's a fairly difficult issue and not very well covered, really. Not you see coverage of it in social media, but man, mainstream media is all just so silent on it. And so good for you putting articles like this out and keeping coverage of it. Yeah. So hey, last article on the Roundup, and this is really so you wrote this piece about you've been a journalist and a mother now for a year, and you've had a little bit of time to reflect on it. And there are a lot of things in there that are packed into that article, and I'd like to go over a couple of those with you. But let's just start off. Like, what's the year been like for you finding balance?
Oh, I mean, the quest for balance is never ending. But yeah, I mean, it's been a beautiful year with my daughter and reflecting on the things that matter to me and where my priorities lay and how I can continue to do my work that I love very much. My work is my vocation, while at the same time being a mom and primarily putting that first and putting Raven's needs first. Well, again, knowing that to be the best mom I can be, I also have to be pursuing my passions and my passions are it's a little challenging in the sense of they'll take me to far flung places in the world. So just navigating all of that and her care, and we don't have family, especially close. So that's been difficult. The cost of daycare is really cost prohibitive for us. So that means that I have to be the mom that stays at home and tries to work at the same time. And that is a can be a heart-wrenching balance too, because I'm trying to do things, um, often projects, like this that um, I wouldn't say especially lucrative, but again, part of my passion and my belief in telling stories. And so that does take moments away from my daughter. So I'm constantly questioning, am I giving her enough? Am I, how am I making this work day by day? And there's a lot of guilt that comes with each day, but again trying to navigate it as best I can. I think every mum has guilt for different reasons. So it's been a beautiful year, but certainly I wouldn't sugarcoat it by saying that it hasn't come with a significant amount of stress as well.
Well, hate to tell you this, kiddo, but you know, I think a lot of people go through that in a period of adjustment, and I think you're doing pretty well. I mean, people that are watching this video, you know, they don't see that you take the time uh, to send pictures and videos of you and that little baby of yours, just to keep updates, and like whatever balance you're looking for, based on those snippets. I think you're probably doing a pretty good job. But so, like, I want to ask you about the back end of that article, with because
Hmm.
you made a notation, and it's a notation of bias in the world, and that you noted that over the past year, a number of people have just been inundating you with, um, uh, how should I put it, negative waves about being able to continue doing this now that you're a
Mm,
mom. And you talked a little bit about that. And but you're not stopping. So, like, if you could share, it you've got enough work to do just adapting internally to what's going on with you.
yeah.
Um, thoughts, expanding on thoughts of, other people opining, and in many cases, even people that don't really know you, opining
Yeah.
on what you should do with your life.
Yeah, a lot of people have, made assumptions that you can't possibly continue to go to war zones or travel or do things once you have a child. Which yeah, it's often people I don't know especially well, but um yeah, that's a reality, and it's always a bit jarring, I think, because then you feel like you have to defend yourself against something you don't have to defend yourself again. And I certainly think that those comments are not made to men, the way that they're made to women, whether that be men in the military deploying, or men going overseas for work, or doing journalism work. I think that, again, those comments are unique to women. Um, but yeah, it's something I have to learn to just kind of smile and nod, and maybe not react to so much, and just again get along with things, block out the noise, and try to forge my own path um without those very overbearing opinions, because they're not especially helpful when you are navigating so many changes, that as I have been and will continue to do in the years to come. So yeah, there's a bit of that, but the point of all, these reflections and looking back, on Raven's first birthday, was to discuss a podcast that I launched this week. It's called Dispatches: Parenting Across Cultures. Something I wanted to do for a long time. Basically, each week I'm interviewing a parent or somebody, that can sort of give very profound insights, not always a parent, but typically from a different country. So it's been really eye-opening. I've put a bunch sort of in the can, that I will release in coming weeks. But insights from people. It's you were my premier guest, Dennis, but also insights from a daughter of a child bride in India. Today I spoke with a friend of mine who was an activist for mental health, for children's mental health and women in a very conflict-ridden area of Cameroon. I have another friend of mine, Rebecca, who was one of the Sudanese lost girls. I have people from Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Malaysia, people that raised their children in China. So just a really diverse mix. And so I am excited to share that with you, just those insights of raising children in these different environments. And it's been a bit of a labor of love. So yeah, I would really appreciate support on that so I can keep that going.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you. So yeah, I love this project for a very long time, and I will share with you that the initial feedback from that premiere episode, uh, the number of men, because it's really an American perspective. The and thanks for letting me be your leadoff experiment, but the feedback I get comes mostly from men who are excited, or it's cathartic for them, and they share stories of similar paths that they have gone through, where society just doesn't feel comfortable with that being discussed out
Mm.
in the open. And and I've heard some of the other interviews that you've done, and similar uh, uh, things are part of that. And so it opens up a different way of looking at things, and I think an important way of looking at things. And so I just I'm your first fan when it comes to that particular project, because there are issues and discussion. It's kind of like the same thing as the cultural taboos that require moral purpose to overcome in the world. This is another one. It's like, here are the things that people don't really want to talk about, but are really, really important, that help people understand a lot more about how similar we are in terms of what it means to be a parent on this planet, and how universal many of these issues can actually be, even though they come from so many different perspectives. But yeah, I know it's available both on I know it's available on its own podcast channel. There are YouTube versions of it, and then it's also carried on Spotify and places like that. So plenty of places for people to go find it and listen to it. And I highly encourage people to do it, because it's a wonderful project, and you've got several more of these in the can. And so very, very quickly, that Filipino dude that was in episode one will fade into the background of all of the other things that are there. But yeah, it was a fun interview to do, and a great project for you to start. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope to continue it. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from other people and other places, and a lot of wisdom that we can take from that, and just I guess looking at the world through a different lens. And that's my goal in my work. So
Yeah. And
there's
let's
another
remind
avenue
people.
for that.
Yeah, and let's remind people that's just another avenue for that. Your Substack, where a lot of these very substantive articles challenging people's beliefs is still out there, and people should read it. There are several of those articles are for subscribers, and they should seriously consider subscribing to those, because there's a lot more meat in those subscription only articles than meets the eye. So very
Thank
well
you.
worth it.
Thank you. Just day by day, trying to get it out there. So appreciate your support.
Yeah, well, I mean, as long as we're rounding up, we got to round up the outlets too, right? So like and subscribe,
Thank you. Please.
as
Yeah,
they say.
please.
Yeah. Yeah, well, because this is going out on a YouTube, so I think that's what people do at the end of these things. Anyway, Holly, thank you very much for another month of roundups of key articles that you selected as being the most poignant ones for coverage. And we'll see you again next month.
Thanks, Dennis. Looking forward to it.
All right.